Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about Venti and Kazuha, two of the most powerful ANEMO supports in the game. The reason I have to make this video is because Venti has a rerun banner right now, and it is also suspected that Kazuha gets one in the near future, and there are two ANEMO supports that are oftentimes compared with one another. Because of this, many people want to know how good Venti is, and whether he's worth pulling, and also a comparison between him and Kazuha, as shown in my poll results from a couple days ago. And so because of that, and with the change of the Spiral Abyss, I do want to go over Venti and Kazuha, compare the two, and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of both of these characters and give you my thoughts on them. And before we begin, I do want you guys to know that Venti and Kazuha are two characters that I've been playing since they came out. I'm obviously friendship 10 with both of them, and I also really enjoy the utility that these characters provide me with and think they're good additions to my account. With that said, I want to start by talking about Venti, his strengths and weaknesses, and my thoughts on him overall, and then move on to Kazuha and compare the two. So starting things off, Venti is a character who recently, especially before the Abyss change, has been getting a lot of hate. He's a character who was once considered the strongest in the game, which makes sense when you consider what enemies there were at the time and what his abilities actually do. Because his elemental burst is a powerful ability that sucks in everything in front of him, groups them up, swirls them together, and has an insane scaling, especially when you factor in how many times it swirls. This ability not only can infuse with another element and proc the Verdescent Venerer set, which will buff your damage and decrease the resistance of whatever you're fighting to the element that you swirl. So not only is that going to, be a good supportive role, buffing your team and grouping enemies, but it will also deal stupid amounts of damage since his burst can swirl up to 14 times. It's actually 7 individual swirls, but once you group enemies together, you can double swirl, which makes it 14. What that means is your Venti is going to be doing insane amounts of damage, both from your swirls and from the really nice scalings of this ability. This burst lasts for 8 seconds, has a relatively low cooldown and so a good uptime, and is an ability that is insanely broken when it works. Now, I say when it works because it's an ability that has its downsides. The reason for this is because this burst, while it pulls in small enemies or enemies that are able to get displaced, some of the bigger enemies, boss enemies, or even just new Inazuma mobs like specters that are small but can't be displaced for some reason, will not get sucked into Venti's burst, while you can still damage them. And as you can see, using your burst on those enemies can still do good damage. They can very easily run out of it or just not get affected by the displacement, which just makes it very wonky. And so because of that, Venti's burst's power level highly depends on what you're fighting. Now, while this is information that you may already know, what I want to emphasize here is how useful this ability can be versus how useful it actually is. A lot of people will see Venti's burst against Inazuma mobs like specters or rift hounds and immediately call him useless and not a worthwhile pull. However, I don't think that's quite fair, because while he is still useful in places where he's not really supposed to be against enemies that he can't displace, because he can still buff your team with the Verdescent Venerer set and still have a good scaling as long as you hit them with your abilities, he won't be as impactful as someone like Kazuha. With that said, however, in places where he works against small enemies, large groups of small enemies, like the current floor 12, which recently changed, Venti shines as being one of the strongest units. In his niche, he's typically unparalleled and just provides you so much value that is really second to none. Yes, other ANEMO supports can group enemies and can be a fine replacement, but Venti's grouping capabilities paired with his damage are definitely the best against displaceable enemies. On top of that, something that people don't really know, and a bit of information that I think is crucial to keep in mind, is that Venti can actually displace some of the larger enemies that you might not think he can. For example, against large enemies like Abyss Lectors, while he can't lift them in the air, he's actually the best ANEMO unit for grouping them together. These enemies are very difficult to displace, but with Venti's burst, as you can see, you can pull them together very easily, which makes for a much easier time clearing this content. Since you can group all of the Lectors together, you can do this before proccing their second phase where they get those elemental shields, swirl them all together, and just make the content a joke. And so Venti can be used on one hand to group them together, but on the other hand also to destroy those elemental shields, as they are pretty weak to getting swirled together, as you can see from the footage. Using an ANEMO unit and swirling these elemental shields into one another is typically a pretty strong strategy. Now, that's not to say Kazuha doesn't work here. Obviously, Kazuha can hold E and group them, but Venti's burst suction is in general just stronger against enemies that it can displace. Now, to keep things Venti focused for this section though, there's a few things I want to say. First of all, for the Abyss specifically, it's something that rotates very often and will continue to do so as new banners and new regions are released. Because of that, Venti's strength is going to go up and down with every new rotation. Against enemies that he can't displace, he'll be decent and not the strongest unit, whereas against large mobs of enemies or enemies that he can displace, he will be amazing. Because of that, while his value is very high right now, who knows where it'll be in the future. With that said though, his niche is something that will come back as time passes. It will always rotate back. It's never just going to be one big enemy for an insane period of time. So I do think he's a good overall addition to your account for convenience and clearing that type of content. Just do keep in mind that there might be some Abyss rotations where he isn't as powerful, like some of the past few ones, where there are boss enemies and where Venti won't be as useful as a support that can buff your team's damage, like a Kazuha or a Sucrose. Now, I do also want to point out that the Abyss isn't the only content in the game, and having Venti for domains, exploration, and just a lot of content where there's a lot of enemies is incredibly useful. Before I move on, I want to talk about some other strengths about Venti. First of all, he is pretty flexible in his builds, while Viridescent Venerer is a must set for him, as it's a great supportive set but also his best offensive one. You can stack Elemental Mastery on him for a pretty cheap build once you get the main stats. Yes, getting a main stat EM piece is quite difficult, but you don't need to focus on substats too much, and alternatively, you can go for a crit build, especially at high investment. For his weapons, there's many good options, with the Stringless, a 4-star weapon, oftentimes being the best one. On top of that, he can be fit in many teams, and he is not dependent on constellations at all. Now, with that said, I believe it's a very important time for me to switch to Kazuha and start talking about Kazuha's strengths and weaknesses, because I don't want to, over or undersell Venti. The reason why Venti can be better than Kazuha in some situations is when Venti can displace everything and group them more efficiently. With that said though, Kazuha can also group enemies well. While Kazuha won't clear a wave of 100 treasure hoarders as fast as Venti will, realistically, not only will he get the job done, but he's also much more consistent. Kazuha works in every piece of content, even against enemies that he can't displace, because he plays a different role than Venti. He is more of a team buffer, a damage amplifier, in the sense that he will give your team a great amount of damage while also grouping enemies and having damage from his own abilities. On top of just that though, his elemental burst has ridiculous damage on not only its own scalings, but also on the swirls that it does, especially against large groups of enemies. His burst can also be infused and will buff your team through not only his artifact set, but also and especially his passive talents. Similarly to how Sucrose gives you elemental mastery, Kazuha will give your team elemental damage bonus, which is good for so many different teams. In fact, giving elemental damage bonus to your team based on whatever you swirl is good for any type of team that deals elemental damage, and makes him not only a good character for convenience and for his own damage, but also oftentimes a great option or even the best option for your team's overall DPS. This means that when you're running teams like a Mono Electro team or a Child Shangling team, or so many other teams of that sort that are using elements, Kazuha can be an amazing option to fit in. He is therefore very flexible and a very highly contested support for so many meta team comps. With that said, the main thing that I do take issue with is that sometimes people consider him a bit too much of a must pull. While Kazuha is great, especially if you're running two elemental team comps that want an ANEMO support, the fact that Sucrose is as underrated as she is kind of what overhypes Kazuha. While I think, as I said, Kazuha is amazing, Sucrose is an S tier character that a lot of people sleep on. Not only can she be ran at ultra low investment, but having access to the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers and the Viridescent Venerer 4-piece, as well as talents that increase your team's elemental mastery, as I mentioned earlier, makes her a similar option to Kazuha, and sometimes in certain team comps, potentially even better. For taser teams and some variations of the national team where buffing your Shangling with this level 1 free-to-play weapon is so valuable, Sucrose can be the premier option. Because of that, you don't necessarily need Kazuha for every team, and this 4-star character can be a viable replacement and sometimes even a stronger one. While I still prefer Kazuha in general, Sucrose's presence as a 4-star replacement to Kazuha makes it to where you shouldn't feel forced to spend your Primo Gems if you can use Sucrose instead. Where Kazuha becomes more necessary though and much more valuable, although I do want to make it clear that I think he's just a really good addition to your account in general, is when you're running two teams that could use an ANEMO buffer, basically two teams that would want a Sucrose or the elemental damage that Kazuha provides you with, which is different than Sucrose's elemental mastery. Now, having two teams that would want that damage increase from Sucrose and or Kazuha is actually very common and not as rare as you might think, because when you look at the powerful DPSs that are in the game, many of which kind of rely on elemental reactions, and even some that don't, would want their elemental damage buffed by Kazuha or just the ANEMO particles from someone like Sucrose, even for characters like Xiao, who doesn't rely, as I said, on any reactions. For example, if for the Abyss you need two teams and you run Xiao on your first half, you're probably going to want to pair him with Sucrose. Now, the odds of you having a second team that don't want Kazuha are honestly pretty slim. While there are some like Arataki Ito and like maybe a Morgana team that could use Venti, and even then you can use Kazuha, a lot of other teams just kind of want a Kazuha. Mono Electro, Freeze teams, any Shangling team pretty much, just so many different meta teams right now can utilize Kazuha to buff your damage and therefore have two meta teams. Kazuha is therefore a master of all trades, whereas Venti is really good in his specific niche. And while Venti can sort of replace Kazuha in those teams, he does not have the same role. Kazuha and Sucrose are the team buffers, whereas Venti is his own thing. Yes, he buffs your team with his Viridescent Venerer set, but he's more of a group enemies efficiently and also deal damage when he works. For more strengths and weaknesses about Kazuha specifically, specifically, it's that number one, he is also in the same vein as Venti for the ease of building. And again, yes, you want Elemental Mastery Viridescent set, which can be annoying to farm, but once you get it, you don't have to focus too much about substats. And also for his weapon, there's an amazing free-to-play option that is quite, well, obviously very accessible since you can just craft it at the blacksmith. On top of that, he's not constellation dependent at all either, and also has a strength of being able to be ran with Venti. In content where Venti works, running a Venti Kazuha Bennett team, even with like no fourth slot or literally any option, can make for some pretty insane clears. And so overall, to compare Kazuha and Venti, since that's what a lot of people want to know, as you can see, they have very different roles. Kazuha is someone who can buff your team's damage while also grouping enemies, whereas Venti is more niche in the sense that he's better at grouping, displacing large hordes of enemies, having really good damage inside of his burst, but not being as universally good as Kazuha. While Kazuha, as I said, can also struggle to displace some enemies, he is always sort of useful because of his passive talent that will greatly increase your damage. Kazuha is therefore more consistent and a better team amplifier, better for your overall team's DPS, whereas Venti won't necessarily be the best for your team's damage itself, but will be the best at, as I said, grouping enemies and clearing content where he works. For many different pieces of content like domains and the current abyss, and this varies based on how the abyss rotates, Venti is very powerful and one of the most valuable characters that can carry the abyss for you. Because of that, how worth he is depends on what characters you have and if you can fit him in a team, and also what characters you need still on your account. The reason I say this is because if you're trying to clear floor 12 and it's a bunch of enemies, Venti can be the best unit, whereas if it's one boss, he won't be as impactful. Because of that, if you're pulling for him for years to come, there will always be certain rotations where he will get value and where you'll have to put him back into your team to where pulling for him will be worth it. On the other hand, there will be some abyss rotations where he's less useful, so he won't be someone that you will always be needing in your teams. Kazuha, on the other hand, is much more consistent because he has a different role, being buffing your team's damage, even against enemies like bosses where his displacement doesn't work. With that said, Kazuha is also one of my favorite units because he's, in my opinion, one of the most fun characters just period, and also is someone who is very easy to get a lot of value out of. You just use his abilities, everything sort of comes together, and your team's damage is increased. And Venti, on the other hand, is incredibly fun and incredibly useful against large hordes of enemies. And so those are my overall thoughts on Venti and Kazuha. I don't want to repeat myself, I think I've gotten my message pretty clear. Regarding which one you should pull if you're hesitating between Kazuha and Venti, it depends on what your account needs. If you want another team buffer, another Sucrose who is usually a bit better and more efficient at grouping enemies, then Kazuha will be the character for you. Whereas if you want someone who fills the niche of being the best at grouping and dealing with large hordes of enemies, being especially useful in content like the current abyss, and also being someone you can use with Kazuha or in the other team for places like this floor 12, then Venti will be the character for you. And I personally believe that both of these characters are good pulls overall. My personal favorite is Kazuha because I think he's always very valuable, whereas Venti is someone that I think can be worth your Primogems and is a worthwhile pull, but only if you have the Primogems for another character, because the difference between Venti and Kazuha is that Kazuha can be the best DPS in your team, even against bosses, whereas Venti obviously is more of a flex slot, more of someone you fit in content where he works, or also if you're playing teams like a Ganyu Freeze comp. And so overall, those are my thoughts. This video was supposed to come out before Venti's banner, but I thought the abyss was going to change, so I figured I should wait before releasing it, and I'm kind of happy that I did. Overall, I love both of these characters, and I hope you will find as much enjoyment with them as I do, as I believe ANEMO characters, Kazuha and Venti in particular, are incredibly fun and make the game a lot easier. Thanks so much for watching. If there's anything I want to add, it will be in a pinned comment. Feel free to like and sub if you're new and enjoyed the content, as it does mean a lot. I have a lot of videos planned, so stay tuned. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.